Then there are the economic factors. We have already discussed at length the debilitating inflation that plagued the Western Empire in its final years. This inflation essentially destroyed the middle class and left the West divided between a few super wealthy landowners and the uncountable poor masses. Adding to the dilemma was a system of imperial taxation which ground those poor masses even deeper into the dirt. The super wealthy were able to defer tax payments until one of those moments of debt cancellation, or else they were able to use their influence to win tax exemptions. This left the poor classes, who had no such influence, to shoulder the burdens of state, burdens that far outweighed their ability to pay. So increasingly, they turned to the wealthy patrons for relief, essentially becoming indentured servants in exchange for the wealthy estate owner covering their tax bills, which laid the groundwork for the feudal system that would rule Europe for the next 1,000 years. This broken economic system also completely severed the bonds of patriotic loyalty that had once upon a time kept the political system functioning. The poor saw the state as a predator to be avoided at all cost. The rich saw it as a petty annoyance to be ignored at all cost. By the late 400s, the Western economy was disintegrating, and the central government was starved of funds. And then, of course, there are the military factors. The legions had been the backbone of the empire for a millennium, but by the 400s, the legions, as we had once known them, were essentially dead. Service in the army was seen by the free citizens as slavery by another name. Hard, dirty, dangerous work that offered few rewards. The rich and poor alike conspired so that they could stay and work the large estates that were fast becoming the backbone of the new political and economic order. As a consequence, the imperial authorities turned increasingly to Germanic mercenaries, who were all too happy to do the Romans' fighting for them. But of course, after Adrianople, these forces ceased even fighting under Roman officers, and instead joined as whole national armies, fighting under their own kings. Though the emperors had little choice, and these barbarian forces fought hard for Rome, there is no getting around the fact that the objectives of Rome and the objectives of the barbarian mercenaries were never going to line up completely, because each viewed the other as an other. In effect, the empire was no longer able to raise a national army. It could only pay for protection. And this, I can assure you, is an unsustainable model of self-defense. Which brings us to the social factors, and my own personal hobby horse when it comes to explaining the decline of the Western Empire. The failure of the Western Empire to integrate their new Germanic inhabitants. One of the great geniuses of Rome had always been its ability to instantly incorporate new ideas and new peoples and new technologies into their empire without being weighed down by prejudice. It's what allowed them to own and operate one of the most ethnically diverse empires in history for hundreds and hundreds of years. When the Roman system began to fail in the 3rd century, for example, it was not senators on the Palatine Hill who led the rebirth of Rome. It was a group of Illyrian officers, mostly peasant-born Illyrian officers at that. Were it not for Claudius Gothicus, Aurelian, Probus, Diocletian, the emperor would have collapsed. Of that, I am quite sure. But as Rome reached a new crisis point, the ruling aristocracy suddenly became obsessed with racial prejudices. The most capable men of the age, Stilicho, Alaric, Aetius, Genseric, Theodoric, were all kept at arm's distance from access to real imperial power by an Italian aristocracy that suddenly began asserting the necessity of ethnic separation. The quote-unquote barbarians of the 5th century were flatly denied the respect of Rome. Their nations were settled in Roman territory as separate nations. their leaders kept out of the imperial structure and forced to live either as antagonists like Genseric or Alaric, or as protagonists like Stilicho and Aetius, who were treated as second-class leaders. And if they weren't second-class leaders, then why aren't we talking about Emperor Stilicho and Emperor Aetius? Mostly, it's because the senators of the West refused to consider the possibility of a German-born emperor. In another parallel universe, the leadership of the West allows for the full social, moral, and political integration of the Germanic people into their empire in the 5th century, setting the stage for the rise of the German emperors, who, like the Illyrian emperors before them, revived the Roman name. These social forces were exacerbated by the religious factors. I will tread lightly on this subject and want to begin by saying that I do not accept Gibbon's argument that Christianity led to the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. But that said, the introduction of Christianity into the Roman bloodstream did lead to constant religious feuding that had been previously unknown to the Romans. Religious tolerance had always been one of the hallmarks of Roman rule and Roman unity. But by the 400s, there had been a transition to increasing religious intolerance. Christianity versus paganism, Nicaeans versus Arians, orthodoxy versus heresy. How many able administrators were caught up in the cycles of religious purges and counter-purges? How much time, energy, and resources were spent trying to bend the empire to one particular version of Christianity and then bend it back when another version rose to prominence? It would be impossible to calculate, but I can't help but think that everyone would have been better served if they had just left religion alone and focused their collective attention on the daily challenges of operating the empire instead. I am not prepared to say that religion was the main reason Rome fell, or even one of the most important reasons. But in a moment when the empire needed unity, religious intolerance acted as a disuniting force. Finally, there are the environmental factors. We are only just now beginning to pay attention to these sorts of conditional elements, but there is some evidence that between 250 and 550 AD, the climate of Europe began to fluctuate wildly. And this was not just a matter of gradual shifting, where the land that had once been good was now bad, but that from season to season there were crazy variations, undermining the kind of predictability an agricultural society requires to remain stable. We certainly see in later years far more sudden famines than we saw previously, and far less ability to absorb those famines when they came. You throw into this mix other underlying environmental factors like plague, and you get increasing depopulation, leading to abandoned land and more famine. I think as we move forward, we will begin to understand more and more the role that climate shifts have played in the rise and fall of civilizations over the course of world history. Or maybe we won't. At the very least, it will be an interesting topic to keep an eye on. All of this, of course, raises one obvious question. If this is all true, then why didn't the East fall? There are, again, no easy answers here, but there are a few broad things to keep in mind. The West had an incredibly long Rhine frontier and an incredibly long Danube frontier to contend with. And once any portion of those frontiers was breached, our barbarian horde could pretty much go wherever it wanted within the empire. Gaul, Spain, Italy, wherever. And after the invasion of 405, this is exactly what happened. In the east, however, once the Huns or Goths or whoever went over the river, they were confined to Thrace and Macedonia. Any attempt to cross the Hellespont, and they'd run smack into Constantinople and its impenetrable walls. Thus, the far eastern provinces of Syria and Egypt, the economic lifeblood of the Eastern Empire, were shielded from any such attack. On their eastern flank, the East dealt only with the Sassanids, a stable and civilized empire that was interested in maintaining peaceful coexistence. This allowed them to avoid the kinds of territorial shedding the West was forced to endure throughout the 400s, at least until the Arabs show up. Second, there is the question of relative wealth, both of the imperial government itself and the East as a whole. The military shocks that hit the West in the 400s rapidly depleted its economic output, and as barbarian nations set up autonomous zones and wealthy nobles withdrew to their estates, the central government was cut off more and more from what little wealth was available. This simply did not happen in the East. And one can never discount the vital trade link to India and China that the Eastern Empire enjoyed. A trade link that was largely severed for the West by the time the axe finally fell. In terms of its ability to support itself then, the court at Constantinople was much, much richer than the court of Ravenna. Finally, there is the question of the imperial apparatus itself. Just as the West's middle class was being killed by a combination of inflation and overtaxation, the Eastern middle class was thriving as it found itself running the now famous Byzantine bureaucracy. Whereas in the West, the super elite had withdrawn its support and resources from the government, in the East, this really did not happen, leaving imperial service as a lucrative and honorable career choice. In the West, you get the feeling that what was left of the bureaucracy was staffed by sadistic gangsters, creating a vicious cycle of disloyalty, greed, and hatred between the people and the government. Though no one ever likes a tax collector, the Eastern bureaucracy just seemed to function a whole lot better, likely because it was staffed by better paid and more talented men. In the end, this is all so much food for thought, and it will remain impossible to conclusively pinpoint the exact set of reasons why the Western Empire fell apart when it did, and why the Eastern Empire did not. Every author you read will have his or her own take, and every generation will produce new evidence that discredits old theories, and then future generations will come along and discredit the even newer theories, and at some point, someone will find new evidence that supports the old theories. History is being constantly rewritten, and frankly, that is the one thing that will remain constant. Which brings me back to the present, then a few thoughts on the future. But first of all, just let me again express my deep, deep appreciation to everyone who has listened to the history of Rome over the years. I always tend to think of it as you guys letting me do this thing week in and week out. No audience, and I would have quit being able to justify spending so much time reading and writing and thinking about Roman history a long time ago. But you hung around in fairly large numbers, and so I got to keep doing it week after week after week. Thank you very, very much. It has been an honor and a privilege to be your guide through the endlessly fascinating history of Rome. If you've enjoyed this trip as much as I've enjoyed putting it together, and think it worth your while, I will note that there is a handy donation button at thehistoryofrome.typepad.com. It will let you quantify your appreciation in dollars and cents. Those of you who